Welcome to Growing Older with Gusto, a podcast that provides a platform for older people who are growing older in a positive and productive way to come on stage and dispense their wisdom. You can find out more about our podcast by going to www.growingolderwithgusto.com. I'm Gail Zugerman, your host, and today we have a very special guest for the holidays and the start of the new year, who happens to be a comedian from Chicago, where he is navigating the ups and downs of life by utilizing his superpower as a comedian and using his great sense of humor. His name is Greg Schwem, and he spends much of his professional time on stage and on board cruise ships. The Chicago Tribune has proclaimed him as, quote, the king of the hill in the growing world of corporate comedy. He's been on SIRIUS Radio, Comedy Central, and has shared the stage with the likes of Celine Dion, Jay Leno, and Keith Urban. So today we're going to talk to Greg about how changes later in life don't have to necessarily be as scary as you might think if you find the humor in difficult and challenging and unfamiliar situations. Greg has also written a very funny book based on his own personal life called Turning Gut Punchlines. So there's a lot to talk about with Greg, so let's get going. Welcome to the show, Greg.
Well, thank you for having me, Gail. Superpowers. I love that. I don't think I've ever been introduced as having superpowers. It's a lot of pressure.
Everything, right?
Yeah.
So why don't we begin by having you tell our listeners a bit about how you got started as a corporate speaker, and which the Huffington Post has called you, quote, your boss's favorite comedian.
Right. Yeah. You know, it's weird. I quit my job in journalism. I was a newspaper and a TV reporter in West Palm Beach, Florida. Did that first 5 years out of college. Always was a comedian, though. Always did it as a hobby. Started doing it in high school. I finally decided after 5 years in journalism, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it is a lot. It takes a toll on you, particularly with when you're the kind of stories that I was covering, which were certainly not funny, very, very depressing, a lot of very morbid stories. And then I would do that during the day, and then I would go to comedy clubs at night, make people laugh. And I eventually decided I liked doing that better. So I moved back to Chicago. I became just a club comedian, the guy that just goes around to clubs around the country and makes people laugh. But little by little, I started getting approached because of the type of material that I was doing in my stand-up act. I was doing material about computers, about business, about meetings, that kind of stuff. And I would have people come up to me afterwards and invite me down to their Christmas party or their golf outing or just little stuff like that. And then that kind of snowballed. The more shows that I did for business groups, the more I got noticed by people who booked those kind of events on a much larger scale. So I was getting approached by corporate speakers bureaus and corporate booking agents and meeting planners.
Kind of word of mouth marketing, so to speak.
Basically, yeah. And I had no idea that this kind of stuff even existed. When you're a journalist, you don't get invited to 3-day offsite meetings. Your boss does, but not you. Someone's got to put out the paper. So little by little, I just transitioned my whole act. Instead of being a club comedian, I became a corporate humor speaker. And that's really what I've been doing for about the past 20 years or so.
Wow. It's an interesting path that you took to that.
Yeah. And it's very, very rare. There's very few comedians or people who started who have transitioned into the corporate market. It's very different than working as a club comedian. I always say I was the class. People always say, that one of the questions comedians get always asked were you the class clown? And I always say, no, I was the class smartass, to use a phrase, and the difference is I always say the class clown is always in trouble because he's always trying to get the other kids in the class to laugh. What I would do is try to get the teacher to laugh. And because you can't get mad at somebody when you're laughing. And I figured that out very early. So I would just kind of sit in the back and pick my spots. But yeah, I always enjoyed making people laugh and trying to figure out what would entertain them.
Interesting. So segue into a more serious subject. We hear a lot these days about the graying of America and the graying generation. And now there's a rise in what they're calling the graying divorce.
Yeah.
So I know that you have experienced this situation, and I'm hoping you can give some wisdom to our audience about sort of how your divorce came about and how you were able to use your superpower of humor to kind of get you through a rough passion in your life?
Yeah, I think, I think my divorce was no different from a lot of divorces. I think one of the reasons that gray divorce is on the rise, and gray divorce is defined as people over 50. Not necessarily how long you've been married, but how old you are physically. It is the only demographic where the divorce rate is on the rise.
Right.
And a lot of it is just attributed to couples who stayed together. They raised their kids, and all of a sudden the kids are gone, and they're creating their own lives. And the couples look at each other and they go, "Now what? Now what?" I think there was a little of that involved in mine. There were other issues as well, but I certainly realized at one point that, yeah, it just wasn't gonna it wasn't gonna happen. You could say, well, did you go to therapy or so forth? I don't.
We'll get into that later.
That's fine. It's a whole nother podcast. But
Man, we're going to talk about it.
yeah. I think that's kind of me. And but it's scary. It really is. I think people in this age group, I think when they make that decision to get divorced, they're only thinking about the positives. They're like, oh, finally, I think probably men especially. They're like, I find, I supported my family. I did this. I paid the mortgage. I mowed the lawn. I did all this. And now, finally, I can focus on me. And that's very common, I think. And I think it's very natural to think that way. But you don't think is you have been married for a very long amount of time. For me, that's half my life. I was married for 29 years. That's half my life. And I think when you are in that situation, you become a little bit complacent. And I don't use that in a negative term, when I think that you're just like, okay, this is what I did. This is what I've gotten used to. My house and this, and I come home and I sit in front of the fire, and every Christmas we do this, and every Thanksgiving we do this, and so forth. And all of a sudden that's all gone. And you are basically having to reinvent yourself. And that's something I think people don't think about. I don't think it's necessarily a reason not to get divorced if you're not happy, but it's definitely something you should probably plot out. I mean, and as I talk about the book, I had not paid bills in 25 years. My ex-wife did that. There were just a lot of things. And that's just what the responsibilities, that doesn't even cover things like, well, how do I meet people now? I've had the same friends for 25 years, but I don't have those friends anymore. How am I going to meet people?
But how did you use your humor? Like right during your separation and then your divorce, but
Yeah.
I know you did use your humor to deflect some of these other feelings that cropped up for you and for others.
Yeah, I think that's natural as a comedian. I think that's what comedians do. We are always looking for the humor in everyday situations. And it doesn't necessarily matter if those situations are funny from the start or serious. I think that's why people always also go to see comedians, because they want to laugh at something that maybe is going on in their life. Nothing makes me happier when I'm on stage, when I'm delivering some material about a particular topic, and I see people in the audience nodding in agreement, looking at one another, because I know I've hit something. I've hit on something here, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, he's saying what I've been thinking." So I think it was natural to do that, and I think laughing is just a way to get through the day.
And I read that it's also really healthy from a physical point of view.
It is.
And
And sometimes you just have to. It's like, you can get as frustrated as you want with with lawyers and with all the things that, unfortunately, the bad parts of divorce, lawyers and moving out and restart your life. And you're going to, I don't care how you do, you're going to come into something that's funny. And it's just sort of how you deal with that. So really, I had always planned to write a funny book about divorce. I just thought that would be a good thing for me to do. I've written a couple of books before, but just to write things down, sort of journal my thoughts. Maybe some of it will end up in my stand-up act on stage. And then, as we'll probably talk about, there was a little twist in there and something totally different.
correct. Okay. Well, I want to talk a little bit about online dating.
Just a little bit.
You do this passage.
Mm-hmm.
What are your ways of navigating these ups and downs of Greg Schwem's life?
Yeah. What would you like to know about online dating?
Well,
Just how you do it?
no, I mean, no. I think basically, how can you keep a sense of humor while you online dating? I think
Yeah. Oh, I think you could. I think reading other people's profiles, it can be very funny. Trying to create your own can be very funny. And how funny do you want to be when you're creating it? What are your ultimate goals? I was, like one of the things that fascinated me when I would get on online dating sites, and I put down that I was looking for people my age. And to be honest, when I entered online dating, it really wasn't it was more of a fact-finding mission for me.
What do you mean?
I knew that I was moving to Chicago, the city. I was moving out of the suburbs. And I wanted to know, before I committed to that, I wanted to meet women my age who also were in the city, just to find out if they thought it was a good move. Was there enough to do? Was it more difficult to meet people? How easy is it to get around, to transportation, all of that kind of stuff. So, and I was very clear about that. I think in my profile, I just basically said, right now I'm looking for friends. I know that sounds like I was looking for a playmate, but like, would you please be my friend? You over 55 ladies, but that's really what it was. And that's what it was for the first few months, and then once you get a little more comfortable and you think, okay, well, now I've met somebody or I've seen somebody, and maybe all of a sudden it's time to see if we can have a new relationship, which we know for someone who's been married for a long time, that's scary too.
Well, do you ever have any instances where maybe somebody's profile didn't match up to what you actually met and saw and interacted with? And
I think everybody leaves something out of their profile. I think that's not necessarily it didn't match up. It's funny. I found a lot of humor in women's profile pictures, because that's the first thing you see. And I was amazed at how many profile pictures from women involved them holding a glass of wine. I don't know why. It's like, what's with the wine? And I mean, these are all different sizes too. I mean, there were some that you could a fish could swim in the goblet they were holding. But I found that to be funny. And how people it's like, what are you trying to portray with this particular photo? But that became for me an icebreaker. Like when I would reach out to somebody, I would make a comment about their photo, not a mean-spirited one, but I remember there was one woman who I was a little interested in. She was on a paddle board, and there was this brilliant red sunset. And I said something like, yeah, I noticed your profile photo. Are you almost done recording your album? Because it looked like the cover of an album or a CD. And she thought that was very funny.
It is.
Yeah. So that's, but yeah, there were a couple of women who I did meet who all of a sudden dropped a little bit of a bomb on me. Just like, okay, now that I've got him in the Starbucks, just going to casually mention, my sobriety or my ex-abusive husband or something like that. And then you got to okay, now you're here. Now I got to deal with that. And am I ready?
Right. Well, not easy.
It's not.
No, and then that might actually send somebody, not you per se, but anybody going through a divorce or something like that, into therapy. And I know that you mentioned in your book that I read, which is so funny, that almost everybody these days does have a therapist, including your therapist. So I was wondering if you would reflect back on your experience in getting through this gray divorce, how would you do things differently? And how did therapy play into it? And
how would I do things differently in my marriage?
No, and just handling the divorce or getting through that.
Oh, okay. Well, I think I don't know if I would handle it different. I think I handled it very well. But I think therapy was, if I didn't eventually go talk to an independent third party, I don't think that would have been a very good way to handle it. And I was always very anti-therapy.
Okay. What did you over that hurdle to get you to?
What got me? I think I just finally, I think running out of people to talk to. And this is something that I think, another podcast host told me off air. He had me on his show, and he was divorced too. And he said, you realize you're going to have to make all new friends. And he said, because your old friends knew you as a couple and you're no longer a couple. And as much as I could say, oh, no. And, these are good friends of mine. We used to hang out at 4th of July picnics. Sadly, that with the exception of a few, that is what happened. And you can be mad about it. You can be upset. You can question whether they were ever your friends in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that does you any good. And I also think that everybody has their own reasons for wanting to, it might just be uncomfortable. It might be your friends are just no longer comfortable talking to you. They question. So I think that's getting back to therapy. I think that's eventually what did get me into therapy, because now you have all these questions like, well, why aren't people reaching out to me? And what did I do? What did I do? Am I suddenly a bad guy? So I think that's one of the reasons.
Were you able to use your humor superpower as a way to overcome any bitterness that you might have, and which is very common among people who either lose somebody because of a divorce or
bitterness, that word can go a lot of different ways.
Right.
I have tried very hard to not bring my personal life and any issues that I might have with my ex into either my act, my book. I don't think that gets you anywhere.
Right.
I think bitterness is something that.
But I guess I was saying, if somebody, not you per se, but anybody out there listening, feels they've been shortchanged because they were a couple, they're no longer a couple, their friends are no longer who they think they were they ever their friends?
Mm-hmm.
Somebody get over that by maybe finding a sense of humor and everything.
Yeah, I think it's good, but I think you have to be very careful because your attempts at humor, and this is true on stage too. Attempts at humor can be perceived very different ways. It can come off as sarcasm. It can come off as bitterness is what you just said. So I think if I've been a comedian for 30 years. I know how to read the room, I think better than some people. But I think some people, when they try to either reconnect with their children or they, after a divorce, they might think they're just being funny and lighthearted, but they might not realize how it sounds to the other person. So I think it's I think it's a very slippery slope. But what got me through it is I knew that other people were going through it too. And if I could make them laugh, just find things on stage to say, and again, get that nodding response from people, then that was probably more therapeutic for me than going to a therapist is a lot of people helped me too, Gail. I want to say this. For one thing, I found out about divorced people divorced is I realized we're all kind of on the same team. And nobody who I met when I told, whether this was on a cruise ship or just random, or maybe I met somebody in a restaurant or something, nobody jumped in and said, "Oh, let me tell you about my divorce. You think yours is bad? Wait till you hear this." You know what? I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to hear the particulars. I always say it's kind of like your delayed flight. Okay. It's different than my delayed flight. All right. So, and I find though, but I think people were not doing that. They weren't trying to top you or turn the discussion to them. Basically, everybody who I broached this subject with said, it sucks, but you're going to get through it and you're going to feel better when you come out on the other side. And that was enough for me.
That's a good way of putting it. I think that's very wise.
Yeah.
Yep. Now, my next topic is also not particularly uplifting, but I really admire you and everything that you've been through. And another life hurdle was when you unexpectedly, while you were going through the divorce, and talk about a double whammy here, you heard the C word, which is one nobody wants to hear. But you experienced this right in the middle of your divorce.
Yeah.
So tell our listeners, how did your natural sense of humor help you get through your diagnosis and your treatment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the double C, that was colon cancer. It certainly put a twist on it. Certainly sent the book in a different direction. As I said earlier, I had planned to write a funny book about divorce, and then this happened. And I think I approached it the way that we've been talking about trying to laugh at something, trying to find humor. I mean, I am a big observer of people. I think that's what comedians do. It's what people say, oh, your business is jokes. It's really not. A comedian's business is people observing and listening, and because that's what ends up on stage. Okay. We have to see something and then we poke fun at it, or we make light of it or something. And that's the way our minds are always working. And I don't think there's any reason that you can't let your mind work that way, even when you are faced with a disease or an unexpected, like you said, diagnosis, or where you're not sure where that's going to end up. And I think it just kind of came naturally to me. It didn't mean that I was going into every doctor's appointment going, "Hey, how's it going, everybody? Hey, nurse." No, I'm not going to be on stage, but I try to get, plus if I could get the nurses to laugh or the doctors to laugh, to me, that was like, if you can get them to laugh, I think they're going to maybe take more of an interest in your case. I remember my doctor, when my surgeon came in, he was telling me like where my tumor was, and it was like right where there was a bend in my colon. So he's like, we're going to take out the like the 90-degree angle. He goes, and then I'm going to put those two back together. And I go, wait, how do you go take this part and put them together? And he without missing a beat, he goes, that's why they pay me the big bucks. I like this guy, and he laughed and I laughed. And I just knew I was in the right hands.
That's great.
Mm-hmm. So, and that doesn't mean it was a yuck a minute. Certainly not the recovery or anything like that. But I do believe that there is the ability to find humor in just about any subject.
Can you foresee that in the future there's so much craziness going on in the world? Do you see humor as a coping mechanism? And if so, like, how can you recommend to our listeners maybe how they can cultivate that? Maybe somebody's taking life too seriously.
Mm-hmm.
You do, but
yeah, I definitely see it as being as a coping mechanism. I think it always has been, and I think it's very sad and a little bit scary that I think, and this has become a topic of one of my corporate presentations. The title is "Humor is Serious Business, but we should still be laughing." And I've given that talk to corporations before, and the whole idea, I think what's happening is we're so busy trying to answer the question, what is funny, which, by the way, there is no answer for. We need to start admitting that there is no answer. Nothing is universally funny, and to try and put rules on what is funny and what is not, you're doing us no good at all. I do believe that I'm seeing a rise in comedy clubs are doing very well right now. They tend to go and they ebb and flow, but I think they do very well when we are in sort of a strange time of a very unknown, what's going to happen. Everybody's a little bit anxious as to what the future is going to hold. And I think people look to comedy as escapism. So I think that's why clubs are doing well right now. It's why I've had a real renaissance in getting on stage. Not that I ever disliked it, but it's just with all that's happened to me and what's going on in the world, I am enjoying the chance to make people of all ages laugh, probably a lot more. Because remember, we're coming out of COVID. We're coming out of COVID where there was no laughter because there was no place other than the internet to sit by yourself with your phone in your room and try and make yourself laugh. We went from that to all of a sudden, okay, it's okay to go outside now. Let's start laughing again. I hope I answered that question.
Yeah, I'm thinking really now about your book. Right here, we have it. Turning gut.
You mentioned the title. The subtitle, though, is what I really like. It's Turning Gut Punches Into Punchlines: A Comedian's Journey Through Cancer, Divorce, and Other Hilarious Stuff.
That is quite a mouthful, Greg.
It is a mouthful, but that's the part that makes people laugh, and that's what I wanted. I wanted because I think it shows what we've been talking about these last few minutes about you can laugh at subjects that aren't considered universally funny.
Correct. So what was your favorite section of the book? I know I had mine.
Okay. I have, well, it's kind of divided into three parts. The first part was kind of the reality of and that's what we talked about. I'm getting divorced. I have to reinvent myself. I have to move out. I have to put my stuff into a storage unit, that kind of stuff. I have to find a therapist. The second part was about reinvention and, trying new things, so I tried things just to more for communication. Like I went to work for Amazon during the Christmas break. I don't need to work for Amazon. I'm doing okay, but I thought it might be interesting to see, I just happened to see like an advertisement saying we need help for Christmas. And December is usually a month that in corporate comedy is pretty slow. So I thought, what the hell? I'll try this. Yeah. Okay. People, if you're listening to this in St. Louis and you didn't get your package last year and end up in St. Thomas, that's my fault. But anyway, I drove for Uber just to sort of try and get material and meet people and just hear their stories. And then the last part of the book is all about just kind of like now is the future. And I spent my favorite chapter is the last one, because the last one I kind of went on a journey to. I wanted to engage particularly with younger people because they're the future. And I wanted to know what they thought of things and how they felt about things like marriage and divorce and therapy. And, I was talking to people of my own generation for the whole time. But I thought, I think it would be a good twist to meet younger people. And because they're going to be faced with these challenges too. And maybe they have ideas that I didn't know about. So I think that is, I looked at a lot of social media of people who were trying to answer the question of what it is to be happy. There's some funny stuff out there. I think that's probably my favorite chapter. Now, what's yours?
Well, I had a couple. One was entitled Single Risable Male Seeks, ...
Right.
And can you just quickly tell some people who might not be in the know about what RIZ means?
What RIZ is, yes. RIZ was the Oxford University Word of the Year. And it always comes out, I think they just had the vote. We're doing this in late December. And I think I read about what it was this year, but they vote on this word. And last year, the word was RIZ, R-I-Z-Z. And RIZ, it's sort of a take on charisma. And so, the younger generation, if they can figure out a way to shorten anything and spend less time, in this case, talking, they're going to do it. So RIZ is like an attraction. You give off a magnetism. So that's where RIZful came in. And that is the chapter that does deal with online dating and profiles and the hits and the misses of these people I met. So I'm glad you liked that one.
It did. And also the one about your trip to Denmark and your discovery of, I didn't think I pronounced this correctly. I should know, but Hygie or Hygie or
Hyggge. This is part of the last chapter, and it's pronounced Hygge. So Scandinavian Hygge. And it's very popular. It's a word for happiness. I was in Denmark. I was in Copenhagen, and I saw a tour on TripAdvisor called the Happiness Tour, and learning about the power of Hygge. And I thought, well, that's exactly what I'm looking for. So I want to see that. And we walked, there were about 10 of us, and our guide, who was about 38, talked about Hygge. And basically what it involves is being present, being in the moment, listening to who you're with. Like his example was, you could use Hygge as a noun or a verb. And he said something like, why don't we go Hygge in the park today? Okay. But if you do go Hygge in the park, you leave your phone at home. Because if you are on your phone, you are not in the moment. You are not is interested in that person who invited you, that you're huging with. And I found that very fascinating. And we know,
And also you're huging, like ing too. You're huging.
yes, exactly, huging. Or it's a very, this is a very hugely, this is an adverb, this is, this is an adjective. This is a very hugely interview because you and I are connecting, we're communicating.
Uh,
And what was really interesting is I happened to, when I was in Denmark, I observed there was a school group, a field trip. And I was looking at these kids, probably anywhere from 8 to 14, no phones, not one. I mean, can you imagine that in this country? No. I mean, they were commiserating with one another. They were listening to what was being told to them about whatever it was they were seeing. And I found that just to be really, really refreshing. And I am a big believer in what has really gotten me through this, I think, is communicating and listening to other people and hearing their stories, no matter what age they are. I'm just very intrigued with people. And I think it's people that gets you through tough times. It's not your phone. It's not necessarily your therapist. Your therapist can be great at dispensing advice, but that's for an hour.
Right.
And then you leave and you've got the rest of the day or the evening to figure out what you're going to do. I have just decided that, people entertain me and they fascinate me, and I want to find out about everybody.
That's great. That's really good. Any other experiences that came out of writing your book that you didn't expect, perhaps?
I didn't expect people to be as forthcoming as they were when I spent a lot of time sitting in, I've always, been a solo traveler on business. I eat by myself. It's just something, you're in a strange city. So I've had no problem like sitting at bars or brew pubs and ordering and trying to talk to other people and so forth. Because that's to me more than just sitting there eating and by yourself and then scrolling your phone every now and then. But I was amazed at how forthcoming people were to talk. And I think that is something that COVID took away from us. I mean, COVID seems very far away, but it will always be there. It will always be, because it changed everything. It changed marriages. It changed how people work. It changed how people get educated. And so it will always, always be a part of our lives. But I was pleasantly surprised. And that's another thing when I drove for Uber. It was amazing how many, if you got people started talking, how much they would keep going. And I find that to be very, very refreshing. And I wasn't expecting that.
Well, you seem like an easy person to talk to, and
I like to think
it's really easy. It's easy for people to open up to, which is nice. Another superpower, Greg.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to find out from you, now that we're at the holiday season. I hope this will air and drop before the end of the year, but if it doesn't, even for the new year, any words of wisdom that you can give to anyone who's lost a spouse, or through them passing away, or through divorce, for in a long-term relationship, anything that they can do, or as far as keeping their sense of humor and getting through this?
Yeah, well, I'm willing to give people the same advice that was dished out to me about how, it sucks, but you're going to get through it and you're going to feel, but ultimately you're going to wake up one day. Maybe not someone who's lost a spouse, but I think certainly for people who are getting divorced. I think though that you have to look that you could sit there and curl up in a ball and just say, my life will never be the same. I lost my companion of this long, and but you can do that. But at some point, I think you got to pick yourself up and say, there's something new. What haven't I done? What have I always wanted to try? And that could be something like a cooking class. It could be a support group. It could be I've always said it's never too late to learn, a different skill or educate yourself about something. That's what I've tried to do.
Smart.
And I would just highly recommend, and again, easier said than done. And everybody is going to have to do that at their own.
You know what? And then when you do those things, you meet people, and that's what it's all about.
Yes, exactly. And you might meet people, you might meet somebody who's going through the exact same thing as you. And you probably up until then thought you were the only person going through this, and you were very lonely as a result. And it doesn't have to be that way.
All right. Well, anything else you want to tell us about your book or anything in general? This is
Well, I do hope people purchase the book. It is on Amazon. It's I will, people who are maybe living in active retirement communities. I've started doing shows in active retirement communities. I think that's I think they love to laugh. That demographic loves to laugh, and they love to laugh at themselves. I think sometimes we aren't good at laughing at ourselves. But I do think when I do shows for maybe an over 55 group, how easy they are at laughing at their health problems, their sex lives, their lack of sex lives, everything like that. Because we look around and, you might as well laugh at getting old because it's going to happen.
and it is a gift.
Yeah. Yeah. So you might as well find something like that to laugh at. So I'd be more than happy to come to any place that you think needs some laughter. And
So
sure.
great. If somebody wants to contact you, what's the best way?
My website, probably it's you see my name up there on the screen. So it's just without the space, gregschwem.com. And and just tell me about your event. And I would be more than happy to come and entertain you.
Okay, that sounds great. Well, thank you so much. This has been so much fun.
Yes.
And for all our listeners, please join the podcast by going to www.growingolderwithgusto.com and share with your friends or whoever you think would enjoy the podcast. And this one, I know you're going to share because it was great. So thank you very much and stay connected and curious.